Good morning, good afternoon, maybe for a few of you, good evening. Welcome everyone to the very first IATI Virtual Community Exchange. Very happy to see everyone, a lot of familiar faces and some new names as well that I've not met before. My name is Josh Powell. I'm the CEO of Development Gateway. I'm very happy to be here to introduce this first session and moderate throughout. So just to quickly introduce myself a little bit, as I said, I'm Josh Powell, I'm the CEO of Development Gateway. I have been involved off and on with the Yachty since about 2010. When I was a graduate student, I was doing some work on geospatial data that became I think the 1.03, if I remember correctly, version of the geocoding standard for the IATI standard. It's evolved quite a bit since then and improved certainly on that work. And I think today is a really important opportunity for us to be together as a community in light of the current state of open data, the current state of the SDGs, and obviously goes without saying, we're all meeting virtually in no small part due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And we're here to really discuss IATI's role in achieving a pretty ambitious aim of providing open and transparent data on development humanitarian resources to have more accountability and more informed decision making. I think now is a really important time for us to be here. It's a challenging time for development, certainly. There's in many countries shrinking civic space and shrinking fiscal space for work. A lot of money is being moved across sectors, moving into the health sector, going into COVAX and other mechanisms, and things are happening quite rapidly. And so having the ability to be able to monitor in real time or near real time what is happening and to be able to coordinate the community is really a critical role for IATI to play. I think this virtual community exchange is also an important time for us all to take stock on the progress that's been made and where we're going and looking forward throughout the 2030 agenda and moving forward. So just to get us warmed up a little bit, we'll start with a bit of an interactive icebreaker. And I wanted to set up a couple of brief polls that we have. If we can pull up the first one, just to learn a little bit about who's in the room and how we're all working during the pandemic. So first, and I'll go ahead and read these out loud, although the interpretation's not yet functioning. Are you wearing pajamas today? Is this a no? Is this certainly yes? Are we, like many of us, keeping formal on top? Or did you do the last minute scramble to get ready for the day? All right, we have quite a few who showed up ready to work, so that's always encouraging to see. And then another almost majority or plurality that showed up at least formal for what we can see on the screen. So we appreciate that. Thank you. And then the second question is more about what's your motivation for being with us today? So what's your main motivation for joining? For many, maybe you're just learning about IATI and you're trying to figure out what it's all about. Others maybe are checking in on its progress and seeing how things are moving on data quality and use. Many of us have a network of peers and colleagues that we look forward to seeing at these events and at least can catch up in the chat a little bit. Some of us may be presenting and some of us may be here because our boss has asked us to. Okay, so it seems like we have a few that are new and about 2/3 that are keeping up with the IATI. So with that, I'll get us started here by handing over to my colleague, Jenna Sloten, who's the Senior Director of Policy and Strategy at the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data. Jenna?
Thanks so much, Josh. So I'm wondering who knows what proportion of bilateral donors have cut aid commitments in 2020. It's just over 50%. But within this trend, as Josh noted, bilateral commitments to health have increased by 73% at the expense of other sectors. And the sectors that are hardest hit are peace, security, and economic sectors. So making this information openly available in a timely manner is really critical and valuable because it enables governments, civil society organizations, and many other actors to plan and manage response and recovery activities. So as Josh said, I'm Jenna Sloten, the Senior Director of Policy at the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Day, and I'm really honored to be joining you here today. Today, I want to talk about the value of open data. I also want to talk about the core values that underpin our data systems and what they need to look like to recover from the pandemic and achieve the SDGs. Data has an interesting property. It does not get used up like food or oil. The more it is used by more people in more ways, the more valuable it becomes. Economists call this a non-rival good. Think of large, well-used data sets like the World Bank's poverty data. Massive use leads to massive value, and open data is premised on this idea. During the COVID-19 pandemic, people are experiencing the value of data like never before. We've seen dashboards springing up all over the place, tracking testing, infections, hospitalizations, and the secondary economic and social effects. It's been really exciting to see open data allowing citizens to verify the progress of the pandemic in their area and advocate for policy change. For example, in Ghana, mobile data was analyzed in real time through a partnership between the Ghana Statistical Service, Flowminder, and Vodafone Ghana. Within a week of the lockdown in Accra, mobility between districts fell by 50 to 60%, and the government could measure the impact of their interventions in containing the virus. But the data was also published on Ghana's Open Data Hub, and citizens could verify the progress of the pandemic in their area and push for public support. Another great example is how open data has allowed social entrepreneurs to address unmet needs. Anyone living in New York who's used TurboVax or similar websites in urban centers around the world knows how helpful these are to find vaccine appointments. In the US, the mess of state and local providers and lists has been a huge challenge for even the most computer savvy. And sites like TurboVax that pull open data from a range of sources and then give ordinary people a view of what might be available in their area is a critical service and a massive relief. The proliferation of data sharing that's powering pandemic response is really exciting. But the potential harm of widely sharing some data has forced us to confront our core values. Think about the controversy over vaccine passports. People are asking, how's my data being used and what does that mean for me and for my community? How are governments and businesses extracting and using data? And is it in my interest? The use of mobility data, contact tracing apps, and sharing sensitive health data between organizations has raised numerous legal and ethical challenges. And of course, these aren't new. Experts across sectors have been grappling with these questions for over a decade as they've become more prominent in the digital age. But with the pandemic, these questions have become more salient in public discourse, and they really had hit home for many people like never before. With these small and large decisions, governments, businesses, citizens are building data ecosystems every day. Whether or not these ecosystems drive a more sustainable and equitable world, as envisioned by the SDGs, really depends on our core values and fundamental principles. And this is coming up all over the place. In its flagship World Development Report, Data for Better Lives, the World Bank has proposed a new social contract for data with 3 core pillars: value, trust, and equity. At the grassroots level, a great example is Restore Data Rights, which is a movement for campaigning for African governments to respect human rights over personal data. And they focus on inclusion, transparency, and accountability. At the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data, our data partnership principles emphasize inclusion, transparency, and accountability, as well as sustainability and delivering for the public good. And through a new initiative called the Data Values Project, our diverse community is defining what the data ecosystems of the future should look like and advocating for the policy change that will bring them in line with our values. What I love about IATI is that it brings data value and core values together. IATI is helping to unlock the value of aid data. The IATI standard enables data to be widely used by facilitating exchange, comparison, and combining with other data sources. And with more use comes greater value. Timeliness is also essential for use. The stats I cited at the beginning of my talk come from analysis of IATI data by development initiatives. This is one of the first times we have sufficiently robust, near real-time aid data to help inform decision-making in a crisis. And IATI is also guided by the core values of transparency and accountability. IATI exists to create transparency in aid flows and aid impacts. Transparency is a key ingredient for aid effectiveness. It can support improved coordination and coherence among donors and alignment with country priorities. And IATI also furthers accountability in data use. A key feature which I love of IATI data is that it can be integrated into government financial systems, because information is power, and partner countries need to understand how funds are flowing into their country and to what effect in order to plan and target their own spending. And donors are naturally going to be accountable to domestic publics, but they also need to be accountable to the governments and people they aim to help. Transparency and accountability are at the core of IATI's mission, and this is driving the production of aid data that is usable and used. So at this virtual community exchange, I encourage you to continue improving the value of aid data while keeping the core values that drive this work front and center, because it's these values that will drive a more equitable world. Thanks so much for having me, and good luck with the event.
Thank you very much, Jenna, and thanks for tying everything back to what our shared values are. I think starting with those core principles is always really critical as a community, and then building into the so what and the how. And with that, I'll hand off to Sherry Lee Erasmus, who is the Director of Global Learning at Accountability Lab.
Thank you so much, Josh, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone joining us here today. I'm delighted to tell you a little bit more about the work Accountability Lab has been able to do over the last year, specifically using data. At Accountability Lab, being a governance-focused civil society organization working across 10 countries, data is really the cornerstone of the work that we do. And having access to open data allows us in many ways to make this data transparent, translated for people on the ground in the countries where we work so that they can use it to advocate around their rights. If we think about advocacy, for example, around disability rights, local grassroots activists need access to the rights enshrined in a constitution or in a Bill of Rights so that they can know what they have to ask for. In a way, for us, open data is that Bill of Rights around development interventions that people should be seeing either at the national or the subnational level in their country. As a result of COVID-19, we all know that a lot more aid has flown faster into countries than it ordinarily would have. Processes such as co-creation of projects or even the fine-tuning of grievance redress mechanisms have just taken place more swiftly than they would have under normal circumstances. And due to the fact that we work in countries with endemic corruption, this creates a lot of loopholes for money to be misspent and really important healthcare, economic, educational resources not reaching communities the way they should. I do stand here today, though, knowing that so much progress has been made using data to shine a light on challenges in the countries where we work, but there's also so much more to be done. And a lot of what needs to be done relies heavily on us working together as an ecosystem to make data more accessible. Over the last year, we've been able to use data to follow the money in a number of countries across the world, such as Liberia and Nepal. Our different teams on the ground have accessed various databases to get a better understanding of what communities should be seeing at the healthcare level with COVID interventions, both nationally, but actually more importantly, what should be flowing down to the subnational level. Because we found that if you can galvanize support and get local activists to work together at the subnational level, we've seen way swifter accountability measures taken by people, just because you are able to, one, make it really relatable for communities what they should be seeing. And with those easy messages, they can translate for themselves whether that is happening or not. And then by equipping them with skills to use this data, they are much better equipped to go and ask their local elected officials or civil servants directly what's happening in terms of the rollout with COVID-19 projects in their region. To be able to do this, we believe that feedback loops are key. More often than not, unfortunately, data remains in an ecosystem between those of us on this call, those of us who have access, those of us who are able to read a pretty technical report and analyze data for ourselves. And unfortunately, this type of data doesn't filter back down to the communities that's affected for a number of reasons. Firstly, we struggle with access to the internet. The digital divide makes it really, really hard for the communities most affected by issues of accountability, transparency, and anti-corruption to access this type of data. And coupled with the digital divide, we can't take digital literacy for granted either. Along with that, we also know that it's not in the best interests of many governments to make data easily accessible to those who would hold them to account. So in this regard, civil society organizations like the Accountability Lab and those we build across the world into our network play a very important translation role. Over the last year and many years before, but thinking specifically around COVID, we have repackaged the data our teams have been able to gather online into easy to understand bulletins and infographics that we can disseminate at a subnational level so that we can foster accountability. We have tried to overcome the digital divide by producing radio programs, specifically also in local languages on community radio stations and in the local vernacular, so that we can overcome literacy challenges. And again, helping to inform especially grassroots level activists so that they can use this data. And where possible, we've convened virtual town hall meetings via Zoom to bring other civil society organizations, citizens, and ward level elected officials together so that questions can be asked about service delivery during COVID. This translation role remains incredibly important because having data available is only half of the story. The utility of the data is really important. And I want to highlight that we've seen a lot of progress around this, but there's a lot more that all of us in this room today can do to make data truly accessible. And so I want to leave us with a couple of questions. How can we better tailor data to really suit the needs of our audience? Who's going to use this in terms of accountability? And when we talk about what we're seeing about results and about funds, are we really tailoring it to the people in the spaces who most need to use this data to advocate for themselves? Secondly, how can we collectively commit to this? Are there ways we can allocate resources to creating more feedback loops so that people on the ground can actually see what's being done? Jenna previously mentioned also the challenges of extraction, especially with regard to COVID, and that's not going to go away. But what can we do as actors in this forum to mitigate that by ensuring that people have access to their data and can actually use that? And how do we use data to effectively build bridges between civil society actors in developing countries so that this data can truly foster accountability? I think we've had so much progress, but I'm delighted to and look forward to what we can do in the future to be translators of data to really foster transparency and accountability with our work. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sherry. No questions so far in the chat, but we do have a few minutes, so I thought I might ask one. So one for each of you. So for Sherry, as you work at the community level, if you had one wish for what this global Yachty community could do to make your job easier there, what would that be? And then for Jenna, GPSTD has done a lot of work on financing for data systems. In that work, and as you've analyzed, Yachty data and other sources, what have been, some of the either challenges or kind of key insights that you've been able to derive from that?
Thanks for that question, Josh. I think my biggest wish list item would really be around translation of data. I think often we create reports with people in this space in mind, not often, most of the time actually, and we created data and reports with academics in mind. And while that is super important, there are also easy ways to create another package set of data, right, which is useful for people on the ground. And I think that often that translation function, making the data really useful in terms of accountability, then falls, unfortunately, on often smaller and under-resourced CSOs at the local or national level. And that's really another sort of layer of work that need not necessarily be there for those smaller actors. And so I think if there can be a commitment from those of us who are in a position to put a little bit of resources towards how do we think about the audience and the end user for this data, because ultimately it's not necessarily those of us on this call who are going to hold governments to account, but the user whose data we collected in the first place. So translating and creating those feedback loops would be really a valuable addition to all of this.
Thanks for that question, Josh. So there's one headline with respect to financing for data. And by that, I mean the overseas development assistance funds that are directed toward support for strengthening core data systems and the use of innovative data sources, so across statistics and data use. And the overarching headline is that this area is chronically underfunded, and that although we saw increases, a slow increase several years ago, it has really plateaued, even in light of increasing demand and increasing recognition of the need for digital transformation. And so what we're seeing is an increased discourse around the importance of data and data-driven decision-making, evidence-driven decision-making. But the financing is not keeping up, particularly in low and middle income countries. National statistical offices and the whole statistical and data system of the country is suffering from underfunding and undercapacity and deprioritization. And there are a few reasons for this. One, based on some research that many of our partners in the Global Partnership have done, and some research that we've done recently with a particular focus on the agriculture sector, that donors are not prioritizing in a strategic way data and data systems. And that's understandable to some extent, because data is a means to an end. And there are more visible, quick wins that one can fund with ODA. But the thing is, right, that funding data delivers more return on investment over time. And there's been a lot of research on this. GPSTD has a number of case studies on our website. Another thing that I think is particularly relevant to the IATI community is that it's very difficult to track and measure funding to data because of the way in which that data is classified. There is statistical capacity building, but then there's all of the funding that's done across sectors that actually strengthens data systems, which is very difficult to capture. And there's some new research on this coming out from the OECD DAC quite soon. They have an informal working group on data for development. So I want to highlight that if internally this issue isn't being prioritized by donors across their sectors and across the way they work, then the funding is not likely to increase. And then also domestically, using domestic resources, governments need to move in a direction where they're seeing data systems, data capacity as a core sort of infrastructure or scaffolding for achieving the SDGs and prioritizing it as such. And that'll make a real difference. That's an area where the Global Partnership is focusing a lot of its advocacy, along with initiatives like the BURN Network, which is a collection of actors who care about data for decision making and pushing for more financing in this area. Thanks.
Perfect. Thank you very much, both. I want to very much thank Sherry and Jenna for their remarks. I think starting us off with values and with understanding what the needs are at a community level is really a perfect way to start off this community exchange. Our next speaker needs very little introduction. The chair of the IATI governing board, Teo, and Teo, as you speak, I did get a question in the chat that was a question of the role of the IATI, and in particular, how the role of the IATI differs and complements the role of the OECD. So perhaps if you can merge that into your remarks as well.
Thanks, Josh. And of course, much appreciation for the kickoff contributions by Jenna and Cherry. Wholeheartedly agree on that one. And I'll try to merge in something, you know, I have strong feelings on OECD DAC. I've been the DAC reporter for many years for the Netherlands, so it should be a familiar subject to me. Let's try and see if I can squeeze it in somewhere. First of all, of course, as chair of the IATI governing board, I would like to use this contribution to officially welcome you to this virtual community exchange, the first global online gathering of the IATI community. More than 350 colleagues from various professions, origins, from government, civil society, the private sector, academia, and others have registered to be with us here today. So in reflection, I would like to extend to Cherry that CSOs are part of the IATI community. The CSO community doesn't have to ask questions to the IATI community, they are part of it. And instead of asking questions, come forward with your demands and try to influence and engage with the discussions, because it's in this community that we determine what we do and how we collect which data. So it's good that all these people are there, thereby demonstrating their commitment to transparency, open data, and effective cooperation. The event represents an important next step in the broadening and deepening of our community. Our stakeholders come from many constituencies, regions, and backgrounds, each with their own needs from IATI and IATI data, each also with different strengths that will contribute to making the IATI community stronger and more successful. I'm sure that you will find today's event both inspirational and informative. Our intention is that we come away with more information and above all on ideas on how IATI is, can, or should progress in order to maintain its position as the multi-stakeholder initiative that provides for the relevant, open, and accessible data on development and humanitarian aid, and ensures at the same time more informed decision-making and greater accountability over development resources. And in that respect, I think there are still various areas where we should develop better and more. Some of the areas that were touched upon by both Jenna and Cherry, which is disabilities, which is capacity building, which is very difficult to grapple in today's existing standards. Well, I'm not talking about the OECD DAC standards, but I'm also talking about the IATI standards. Leaving no one behind is a concept which is extremely important, but we still have not been able to tackle that sufficiently in the data standards in order to get the proper information we want. So relevance of data is important, and I think we should do everything we can to keep it relevant and to open up into new areas at the same time. And this is why it is so important that we have a multi-stakeholder analysis. Follow the money, I wholeheartedly agree to that, but to me the major purpose is to follow the money to see if it makes the difference we are aiming for, and not for the sake of accountability of itself. Over the course of the day, we, as members of the IATI community, will discuss, debate, and share information on our own publications, as well as on our use of IATI data. Users and publishers are becoming blurry distinctions. Learn about where IATI is making progress and where challenges remain or new ones are developing, and better understand how we can collectively work together to achieve the goals we've set for ourselves in our ambitious 5-year strategic plan. While in 2021, unfortunately, we will only meet virtually as a community, with another virtual community exchange planned for later this year. I'm energized by having all of you here with us today, and I encourage you to participate in as many sessions as possible during the course of the day. Share your experiences and contribute to this growing community of practitioners interested in increasing the effectiveness of our support to sustainable development. With that having said, I'm not sure entirely, Josh, whether I've touched upon the question sufficiently, or whether you want more extensive comparison between IATI as a multi-stakeholder analysis and OECD DAC, which is, when it comes down to it, is an accountability tool for bilateral donors to show that they have provided for certain levels of ODA. The results part of OECD DAC is, well, except in specific working groups, but it's not present. I've indicated some of the, let's say, white spots, both within the OECD DAC statistics, by the way, as well as in our own standards. And I can assure you from my own experience that it's extremely more easy to come with changes to the IATI standard than it is to really influence standard setting in OECD DAC, not in the least because the purpose is entirely different than the one we are aiming for within IATI. So having said that, I think there's all the virtue in putting all the energy in IATI and the discussions in IATI to maintain relevance of our initiative. With that, I hope that I've addressed your questions sufficiently. Yes. And I want to thank you again, all of you, for joining us. And I hope we have a very fruitful and inspirational afternoon. Having said that, I'm handing over back to you, Josh.
So with that, we'll move forward to our next panel of speakers. I do want to flag and strongly invite everyone to please add questions as they come to your mind into the chat, so that I'm not left as the only one asking questions of speakers, because I'm sure others have far more interesting questions to ask. We're going to start with about a 2-minute from each introductory remarks. Perhaps Winnie, if I can ask you to start. So Winnie Kamar is an IATI governing board member and is on the Association of Freelance Journalists. So if Winnie, if you can start, and then David will go to you, and then Andy to you.
Hi everyone, and sorry, my background screen is misbehaving, but here I am. And my name is Winnie Kamar from Association of Freelance Journalists, and I'm honored to be part of this great discussion and this great initiative, inaugural initiative of the virtual community exchange. And I really like the opening remarks that have been made by Jenna and Sherry. Yeah, and before even I start, I'd like to say Ramadan Kareem to all our Muslim brothers and sisters on this call. Even as we start this journey, we just pray that you continue well. So going back to what has been said, I would like to say that currently there's a revolution that is happening and that is taking place, and the demand of data is a reality. And I speak to this example that happened recently in our country. I come from a country called Kenya. It's in Africa, and it's in the eastern part of Africa. And recently there was a loan. IMF was willing to give the country a loan of 3.2 billion. And this brought out a reality of many things that came out, and it was all propagated because currently we're in a lockdown with the pandemic, and so the city and other 4 towns around, counties around us are currently under lockdown. So we can't move, we can't gather together, we can't do anything. We are all working from home, and the issue of the IMF came up, and people gathered online in the online spaces, and they were able to voice out their feelings, and they were able to rally together. And we've already then gotten guys signing up to a petition against that loan, because we have seen, like what Sherry mentioned, the reality is lack of accountability going to the ground. And the president once said that in Kenya, we lose 2 billion Kenya shillings daily. So that made people furious, and that made people want to know why would get more loans so that we can be able to help the pandemic. Help in mitigating in the pandemic. So that's a reality. That's a case study for us. But how does the data apply? The documents that were shared with us and with the communities on different social media platforms were IMF documents, and the data that came out from the data that came out was showing how much are sustainable, because at the end of the day, the IMF said Kenya is a sustainable country, they can be given the loan. But for Kenyans, it was a reality for us to see that the data that came out was how much borrowing and how much we are able to help ourselves, or to domestic financing and internal financing in the country. So this is a reality for many African countries. This is a reality for so many people, that data is there. But how best, and like the presenter said, how best can we be able to change it, or make it into palatable format? The visualizations really helped, because from the visualizations, then people were able to see, oh, this is what has been happening. And now it made Kenyans more informed that this is the amount of money that we're going to be getting, and this is how much we have in country, and this is vis-a-vis the external funding that we're getting. And then I'd like to echo some words that were made by the Prime Minister of Israel on data. Currently, there's a revolution that is happening, and there's the demand for data. There's a demand for data. And in as much as we have the challenges of making the data palatable for our consumers, even as a journalist, but there's a huge demand. There's a huge demand of data. Where is this money coming? When you say you're going to mitigate a certain thing, you're going to mitigate on COVID, or even you're going to give vaccines, how many vaccines are coming into the country? How many people have been vaccinated? And what are the reactions of these vaccines? So this is a kind of data that is being demanded. And this is the kind of data that people are looking at. And I echo the words that there's a wealth, the wealth is in innovation. And it is driven by the confluence of big data, connectivity, and artificial intelligence. We have not reached there yet, but we are getting. Sorry.
No problem.
Let me wrap it up there. That as we are innovating and looking at and using the big data and the small data that we have, then we are able to make sense and also bring out applications that really help the citizens.
Perfect. Thank you, Winnie. And I think you touched on a lot of important issues. Obviously, the issue of debt is a really important one. A number of my Kenyan colleagues also alerted me to that IMF conversation. And I know there are strong feelings from citizens in many countries, and having access to information is really crucial to be able to engage in those conversations. So next we'll go to David Meganson. David is the standards lead at UNOCHA on the Humanitarian Data Exchange. David, 2 minutes, over to you.
Thank you. I've been in the IATI community for over 11 years now, mostly doing humanitarian work. Humanitarian is a little different from development. It's more about now instead of later. We track different goals like the Grand Bargain, humanitarian response plans, the Global Humanitarian Response Plan for COVID-19, things like that. And I have found over the last few years, I've been involved in several initiatives trying to use IATI operationally for humanitarian purposes. And I've got good news and bad news about it. The good news is that what we did would have been impossible without IATI. The bad news is it's way harder than it should be, and we can't get as much as we want to. I know the next panelist, Andy, has been involved in a couple of those initiatives with me, so she can certainly attest to how challenging this has been. But whether you're trying to find out about multi-year funding, cash programming, whether you're trying to identify local actors so that we can track the Grand Bargain commitment to have more direct funding go to local and national actors rather than go through international organizations. Local and national actors who do the actual work in aid rather than sign the checks are mostly still invisible in IATI. It's a real challenge. Every place we turn, we find we come up with a problem that Sherry mentioned in their opening talk, which is it's not so much about data quality or data use, it's about data usability. And data usability means thinking about fitness for specific purposes and then gaining a consensus among the publishing organizations to modify their data so that it's suitable for those purposes. Whether it's giving credit to your local partners, which some international organizations do, but most don't, unfortunately. Whether it's more accurately dividing up your data by location, especially subnational or sector, using humanitarian clusters. Anyway, that's my timer, so I wouldn't go over. But all of this, I think, is very important. I hope these topics come up over the VCE. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much. And next we'll go to Andy Vaughn, who's the Senior Policy Advisor at USAID.
Thanks, Josh. And thanks so much for having me. And also just quick thanks to Secretariat for all of your work in organizing this event. I'm really excited to be here today to focus on IATI and to interact with this large and, as I can see on the participant list, definitely growing community that is IATI. At USAID, we're really committed to transparency, and we've worked really hard the last few years to improve the quantity and the quality of data that the agency reports on development and humanitarian assistance programs. And I would say, if anything, the last year has really demonstrated to us how critical transparent, easily accessible, comparable data is for complex, fast-moving events like COVID-19. And I think, as been discussed already this morning, IATI has an important role to play in addressing that need. But I think it's really important to remember that all of us in the community also play a really important role in addressing the need and in IATI. And consistent, committed efforts on behalf of the entire community here today, to improve reporting, that remains a clear path to understanding the funding environment, to ensure transparency around funding intended to address COVID-19, and also just follow that through to impact. And so while it's been great to see this, important and critical role IATI has played the last year, there's definitely more work to be done. And as outlined in the strategic plan, and it's USAID as a publisher and a data user of IATI information, there's more work to do to improve quality of information published, increase use by local stakeholders, and honestly increase use of IATI data internally for our own decision-making processes. So I'm really excited about today, and I hope we all come away with ideas on how we can improve within our own organizations, and then how we can work within this community to increase access and use data to better analyze information. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much, Andy. We've had quite a lot of activity in the chat, which is great to see. It's really the purpose of the community to be having these conversations. I'll highlight a couple of quick themes and then give 1 minute question each to Winnie and to David. I think key themes have been around ability to use data and interpretation of data and kind of the accessibility. Also a lot of interest in what Winnie was describing within Kenya. So maybe Winnie, I'll go first to you. Just 1 minute, as we're quite short on time, on how journalists are using let me find the question, how journalists are using the data to check the government on how well it's using the loan that you mentioned. And then David, to you after that, to talk about initiatives that you've seen to support people in being able to more effectively use the data.
So how are journalists using the data? We are being able to tell the stories, and the stories is asking you have to do the research, and the research means going through and combing the documents that are available, the open data that is available. So you go combing the different websites, and you're able to get the data, and from there you're able to, it informs your story telling. So that's how best we are able to use the data. Yes.
Thank you, Winnie.
Okay.
David, to you.
Certainly, thank you. I'll just name a few of the initiatives that I've had some contact with. One of them has been trying to use IATI data for tracking against humanitarian response plans, which are like our SDGs, but they're very immediate, have specific numbers, and they're just for this year. We've been trying, right now we have a service called Financial Tracking Service that does that. It's labor intensive. We've been experimenting with USAID as a partner and the Netherlands Ministry of Foreign Affairs to try to get more automated data feed in. It can work, but it's a huge amount of labor to make it happen. Andy mentioned the COVID-19 tracker, tracking funding against the 2020 Global Humanitarian Response Plan. Outside of the UN, I've been doing some work with development initiatives, Josh, on trying to connect other data sources on local actors into the IATI ecosystem so that they become visible to donors, so that they can at least know that they exist, know who they've worked with, and have an opportunity to direct more funding towards those local actors rather than through intermediaries. Should I go on, or is that my minute?
I think that's your minute.
Okay, perfect.
And maybe if you can use another 30 seconds for Anand's question on how HDX and IATI complement each other and avoid duplication, I think that would be useful as well.
Well, excellent question. Thank you for asking that. So HDX is the Humanitarian Data Exchange. It's a community exchange for the humanitarian sector where humanitarian actors can share any data that's relevant. So most of the data on HDX is not financial. It's assessments, response plans, baseline data like population, humanitarian caseloads, refugee numbers, infection rates, things like that. However, on HDX, we do also include simplified IATI data sets. Since humanitarian action is usually confined by country, at least the international actors are usually deployed by country, we divide up the IATI data by country and make it look like humanitarian 3W, who, what, where reports, so that humanitarian actors who usually work in a silo can see development and other kinds of work happening around them. So those are all available, and I'd be happy. My email is Meganson, my last name, @un.org. So just send me a private email if anyone wants to follow up.
Great. Thank you so much, David. And thank you to all of our panelists and speakers in this session. I think this was hopefully a really good appetizer for the rest of the day. And to see that IATI is relevant from the very kind of global stage and humanitarian coordination and responding to the COVID-19 pandemic, all the way down to the community level, and what are some of the opportunities and some of the challenges at each of those levels. There were some additional questions in the chat that we didn't get to. I believe through the virtual community exchange, we should hopefully be able to identify the people you want to reach out to. But I know that members of the Secretariat would certainly be happy to help make connections as well if there were questions you had of our panelists that we didn't get a chance to respond to. And just to say thank you all so much, and I hope everyone has really fruitful and enjoyable conversations throughout the rest of the day. Thank you.